Hey, idiot! Do you know how to properly play ZZZ's combat? Oh, you only press 3 buttons. Well, you're pressing my buttons by saying something so stupid. Do you know what Daze is, or what Anomaly buildup is? These mechanics aren't really talked about much, and I can see some people straight up not paying attention to them at all, and that would be a big mistake. They're essential to this game's intricate combat, and they'll absolutely need to be known for this game's future. So if you don't even know what I'm talking about, then sit down, shut up, because class is in session. Also subscribe, please. This is a new channel. Also subscribe to my other channel related to gacha game stories. Thanks, bye. Let's talk about Daze. If you played the game at all, you'll notice that, well, at the beginning, you'll be seeing this screen a lot. This is called a chain attack, and it's happening because you're getting this meter right here to 100%. This is the Daze gauge, and it accumulates when you attack. Simple enough. You want chain attacks to happen because they're incredibly powerful and have high damage multipliers. Now, you might be wondering why you're sometimes getting more than one chain attack, and that's due to the type of enemy that you're fighting. The normal small enemies, elites, and Republic. Normal enemies you can do 1 chain attack, elites 2, and bosses 3. Having a Bangbu in your party also allows for an additional chain attack when they're chosen, having them do an attack and then the next character immediately doing theirs. So effectively you can have 4 chain attacks. So that's why you've been getting different numbers of chain attacks. But like, why do chain attacks feel kind of random? Well, that's because they don't automatically pop when an enemy gets to 100% on their Daze gauge. Instead, they only pop when you get the gauge to 100% and then use a heavy attack. Heavy attacks are the end of a basic combo, any version of a skill, ultimates, assists, holding the attack button with certain characters to do their like kind of charge attack. Just a lot of stuff will initiate the chain attack. Getting chain attacks definitely isn't the only reason to raise the Daze gauge though, because when the Daze gauge reaches 100%, the enemy becomes stunned. While stunned, the enemy can't move or attack, and they take extra damage. The extra damage that they take while stunned is at least 1.5 times, and it can get well above 2 as well. So then the simple goal to combat is this. You build up Daze, break the gauge, launch a chain attack, and then focus on doing as much damage as possible during the stun period so that you can maximize that extra damage percent that it presents. So does Daze accumulate the same for every character? Well, no. What affects Daze is how much you drink. Right, Kyle? Remember when we got so dazed the other day that I started sucking your toe? Daze accumulates based on a character's Daze multipliers, which you can actually see if you go into their skills. But if you want a more simplified answer, characters with the stun fighting style are more focused on accumulating Daze. So these characters. But 2 of these being S-rank characters means that most will only have Anby. So let's talk about her as the example. If you look at her talents and abilities, they're focused on dealing increased Daze multipliers, meaning that playing Anby optimally means you're going to be breaking enemies' Daze gauges really quickly. Not to get too much into team comps in this video, but as you can see, if combat consists of these 2 phases, one being building up Daze and the next being taking advantage of the increased damage percent that it presents, then having characters that are centered on dealing increased Daze multipliers, so stun characters, is pretty essential. So besides the multipliers themselves, is there any other way to increase how much Daze a character deals? Yeah, there is. Yeah. There's a stat called Impact that every character has. Impact increases the rate at which you daze enemies. So stacking that stat on stun characters makes them even more useful in this regard. So we've explained the Daze gauge, who can make use of it, and what happens when it breaks. Looks like that's everything that needs to be what the fuck is that? Yes, there's an extra gauge that you've likely never seen or paid attention to unless you're an owl or a hawk. So let me explain this sweet pea gauge for you real quick. This is the anomaly buildup gauge, and depending on what you build it up with, when it maxes out, it does some interesting stuff. So let's first explain how you build it up. Each character in the game, aside from the fighting styles that we spoke of earlier, also has an attribute typing. These attributes are fire, ice, electric, physical, and ether. When attacking an enemy with an attack of an attribute, this gauge will build up. Technically, every enemy has 5 of these gauges, all representing each attribute. They're technically just invisible. but you're only able to currently see the one that corresponds to the attribute that you're attacking the enemy with. This matters because if your team consists of 3 different attributes, even though you switched out of a character and attacked with a different attribute and it looks like the other attribute bar is gone, it's still there and the amount is still the same that you've built up. We'll get into why this matters in a bit, but just keep in mind that you're going to always be building up this gauge by attacking with a character, and these gauges don't reduce or actually disappear. So what happens when this gauge pops? Well, it will add different status effects to the enemy depending on what you broke the gauge with, and might even add some burst damage. Let's go through what happens with each attribute. Fire adds burn, dealing a dot, as well as making enemies of the organic type unable to act. Electric adds shock, which makes attacking an enemy deal additional electric damage, and it makes machine type enemies unable to act. The next 3 are definitely more interesting than electric and fire. Physical adds a large amount of physical damage when it pops, and it interrupts the enemy. But it also increases the daze that is inflicted on the enemy for a set period of time. Ice adds 2 effects. The first is freeze, where an enemy becomes unable to move, but also if the enemy has had their daze bar broken already, it stops the stun timer from depleting, meaning that the enemy takes additional damage for longer. Ice also adds frostbite to the enemy as well, which makes the target take increased critical damage, and ice can do shatter, which is a large amount of ice damage. Finally, ether adds corruption to an enemy, essentially charming the enemy, causing them to attack everyone, even other enemies. Corruption also causes the enemy to take ether type damage based on the hits that they receive. It's similar to shock, except the ether damage can proc even faster than shock, meaning characters who hit really quickly can absolutely take more advantage of this status effect. Also, if an enemy is an ethereal, there's the added benefit of interrupting them. So that's a lot, and you probably have a lot of questions. And same, this game hasn't been out for like a week. But there's still some extra stuff you need to keep in mind about the build-up phase for these effects. The initial damage and dots attached to these anomaly effects are based on the characters that built up the bar, and that includes if multiple characters built up the same bar together. So imagine you're running an all-electric team, and they all contribute to the shock anomaly build-up bar together and equally. Well, the damage calculation that occurs at the end would be based on all 3 of your characters. So 33% of the damage applied through shock will be based on each character's stats. But which stats? Well, anomaly proficiency. Every character has some anomaly proficiency, and raising this stat will raise the damage done through the effects added when that character contributes to the anomaly buildup gauge. You might have also noticed that there's a stat known as anomaly mastery as well. Well, raising that stat makes the buildup of the anomaly bar go faster for that character. So if you wanted a character focused on building up the bar and doing a lot of damage with it, when it's broken, you'd raise both of those stats. Speaking of damage, the damage done from the anomaly effects are impacted by the damage percent increases given when the daze bar is broken, meaning proccing anomaly effects after you've accumulated 100% daze deals way more damage. But what if you procced multiple anomaly bars one after another? I said before that technically enemies have 5 gauges, and if you're using teams with more than one attribute, you're going to naturally be building up these attributes together. Well, let's say you have shock just procced on an enemy, and then let's say you build up and also proc something like physical immediately after. Well, when another attribute anomaly gauge gets popped while another was recently popped and the effects are still active, you get an effect called Disorde that occurs. Disorde deals an immense amount of damage and gets rid of the effects from the first anomaly and adds the effects from the one that you just popped. The damage from Disorde is based on the anomaly that it's overriding, and this effect will also deal daze to the enemy. This all means that you can run mono teams where the goal is to increase the same anomaly bar as quickly as possible together, or you can run duo or triple attribute teams where you can trigger multiple anomalies, albeit much slower, but you'd be able to potentially cause disorder if you time your pops right. So let's get into what this means when you're playing more difficult content once you reach this game's endgame. You want to take advantage of breaking the daze bar on enemies, meaning you'll want characters like Anby who can do it even faster, and stacking the impact stat on those characters would be the goal, since it's the daze stat. Then anomaly effects shouldn't be slept on either. There will absolutely be characters in the future who have broken kits surrounding anomalies, similar to like Dot or Break characters in Honkai Star Rail, or Elemental Mastery in Genshin Impact. These were stats that were initially slept on in those games because they were a bit harder to grasp than stats like attack or defense. But as we've seen with these games, They're arguably the most important stats in the game and have such an ability to be a playground for the devs that they're continually being played with. The same will clearly be true in this game. Characters like Piper and Grace already show what characters built around these effects kind of look like. So absolutely keep these ideas in mind now that you know how these mechanics really work. Also keep in mind, subscribing to this channel for future combat videos and news-focused content. Also check out my Stray Maverick channel for story-related videos. And also, you can get out. Class dismissed!